Miran y aprenden. Aprendan. Si ya intuyen que hay algo que no entienden del fútbol y terminan contratando técnicos argentinos para ser competitivos, terminan nacionalizando argentinos, jugadores de cualquier parte del mundo para armar un plantel, ya se dieron cuenta que no están a la altura. Pero en vez de aceptarlo, cerrar el orto y aprender del más grande, ¿no? ¿Qué hacen? Le regalan la copa. Encima, son tan infantiles tus argumentos, mexicano bizarro, que empezás a gritar, argentino, no tenés plata, sos pobre, no tenés para comer. Ganamos el mundial, argentino, compraste la copa. ¿Con qué plata la compré, retrasado? No soy pobre y un endeudado y muerto de hambre. ¿Con qué?
Latas de atún, bajas y España, subido a la Torre Blanca. Todo se ve tan alto, soy un pigmeo, pero me la creo. Soy el enano marra, el enano marra, el enano marra. Me gusta el atún, las bajas y España. Soy el enano marra, el enano marra. Se terminó el atún y ahora soy flaco. Soy asesor muy importante. Para mi ley mis consejos son relevantes. El enano marra, el enano marra. Me gusta el atún, las bajas y España. Soy el enano marra, el enano marra. Latas de atún, bajas y España, subido a la Torre Blanca. Todo se ve tan alto, soy un pigmeo, pero me la creo. Soy el enano marra, el enano marra. Me gusta el atún, las bajas y España. Soy el enano marra, el enano marra. Se terminó el atún y ahora soy flaco. Soy asesor muy importante. Para mi ley mis consejos son relevantes. Soy el enano marra, el enano marra.
Buenas noches, bienvenidos a todos. Esto es El Hit, un programa que sale de lunes a jueves a las 7 de la tarde en este canal que es PelaVisión.
El hermano de Tamara Petinato era bastante mejor.
Era bastante, por lo menos le daban el
Era
tono.
bastante mejor, ¿no? Hasta prendiendo fuego.
Alberto no dijo nada de todas las minas que nombró en centrales atómicas, en cancillería. Iba a visitar un colegio, el tipo iba a visitar un colegio. Qué linda que estaba de matemática, me la puedo archar.
En un lado habla de reducir la cantidad de plantas o la cantidad de transporte que se puede tener cuando uno circula, teniendo reprocan.
Hola amiguitos, ¿cómo están? Bueno, hoy vamos a hacer una focaccia. Lo que vamos a hacer es agarrar esta cosita de harina, la vamos a abrir y la vamos a verter por todo el pollito. Y porque mi novio sí me recaga palo, pero bueno, yo le tengo que cocinar porque si no me encierra y no me deja salir como por 6 días.
Una devaluación te lo puede llegar a esperar un tipo, un terrateniente de eso que dicen Moreno de las 1000 familias. A esa gente le sirve, al tipo común lo hace pedazo como hace pedazo cualquiera.
La oferta de Colapinto termina siendo buena porque es un piloto de la casa, porque fue contratado por la Academia de Williams, tuvo buenos resultados en Fórmula 3 y en Fórmula 2.
Está menos claro que sea negro, puto judío. Bueno, lo de los judíos en realidad lo estamos reviendo. No sería tan así, los judíos están ok.
Me tienen acá, un poco cambiado quizás. No me veo como generalmente me veo. La cámara un poco torcida. Quizás unos 30 centímetros menos. Quizás en 35. Mi nombre, gente, es Jordi Canela. Y nos vemos mañana a las 7 de la tarde acá en PelaVisión.
Llegó Umonia, Umonia. Es el economista más chanta que hay. Cuando él llega, de humo todo llena. Y cuando el humo ya no deja,
Esta proclama es patria o muerte.
Vocero es el mejor videogamer. Toma cualquier hater. En su cabeza es un dios. Vocero, vocero. Pero en su cabeza tiene alto pienso. Vocero, vocero, vocero. Dice ser del pueblo, pero cobra terrible sueldo. Con la tuya contribuyente. Es el vocero domador, vocero, aunque los domados sean todos nabos. Vocero, vocero, aunque nombre a mi hermano sin contarme la mano. Vocero, vocero, el león religión. Vocero, vocero, es el mejor video que toma cualquier hater. En su cabeza es un dios. Vocero, vocero, pero en su cabeza tiene a todo pienso. Vocero, 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 dice ser del pueblo, pero cobra terrible sueldo.
Hola guachines, ¿cómo andan? Richis, ¿cómo están? Hoy tenemos un programa especial. Como siempre, viste que las noches del Pela. Hoy estamos empezando una noche del Pela un toque temprano, ¿no? A las 6:30 de la tarde, ¿no? Para que los bosteros de alguna manera tengan algo con que distraerse, ¿no? Que no se amarguen, que puedan como distraer un poco su cabeza de la amargura que es tener a Riquelme de presidente de un club, ¿no? Pero bueno, no los quiero torturar con eso. Por eso hoy estamos haciendo un especial de ¿llegamos a la luna o no llegamos a la luna? ¿Ustedes qué carajo creen, guachines? Acá veo que ya Mariano Ferrari está diciendo que la luna es de plasma y demás. La luna tiene cosas raras que inclusive los científicos lo comentan, que es que tiene propiedades extrañas. Han hecho distintos experimentos, ¿no? Y aparentemente podría ser hueca la luna. Es como que es extraño porque todos los cráteres parecieran tener como la misma profundidad. Y bueno, hay un montón de cosas, sobre todo que cuando le pega a un cráter es como que hace un ring y una vibración la luna, ¿no? Y bueno, hay un montón de cosas que dan como para pensar que es hueca. Inclusive la ciencia no entiende bien qué onda con la luna. Bueno, según la historia de la humanidad, hemos llegado a la luna en el 68 con la misión Apolo 11 y luego, bueno, no se ha vuelto a hacer viajes espaciales de ese estilo. Hay muchas teorías, ¿no? Al respecto de por qué. Si vamos a la teoría que para mí tiene más lógica y sentido común, ¿no? Es que lo que tuvo que ver con la carrera espacial fue totalmente incentivado por la Guerra Fría y la carrera espacial en el 69, perdón. Dice ahí Mariano, no sé, yo creí que era el 68, veremos ahora qué nos dicen los documentales, pero puedo estar equivocado, no lo acabo de leer, así que puedo decir cualquier fruta, cualquier cosa, me corrigen, guachines. Bueno, a Exgon, ahí gracias por la donación. Pero bueno, fue totalmente alimentado por la Guerra Fría y por mostrarle la superioridad al mundo de qué sistema era mejor, ¿no? Y ponerse como modelo a seguir en el mundo. Estados Unidos con su capitalismo y su tecnología avanzada de posguerra, y la Unión Soviética con el comunismo, socialismo, compitiéndole de igual a igual, ¿no? Y habiendo como una guerra fría terrible, ¿no? Hasta ese momento no se sabía quién podía ganar la carrera. En la época espacial, tanto la Unión Soviética como Estados Unidos estaban compitiendo, y hasta que, bastante avanzado en la carrera espacial, la Unión Soviética le venía rompiendo el orto. Había metido un satélite antes, había metido un chabón en la Luna antes, y Estados Unidos venía corriendo atrás. Y luego de la llegada de la Luna, ¿no? Que no volvimos nunca más. Y muchos se preguntan, bueno, pero si teníamos toda esa tecnología, ¿por qué no volvimos nunca más? Y es una pregunta válida, ¿no? Que te responden con que, mirá, fuimos a la Luna, si bien hay minerales valiosos en la Luna, para poder hacer minería espacial y demás, necesitaríamos invertir una cantidad de plata que en los 70 no había chance de seguir invirtiendo en todo eso, en los 70, en los 80, y no tenía sentido, digamos, invertir tanto, sobre todo después de la caída de la Unión Soviética, que ya no había una guerra fría que incentive, digamos, seguir metiendo guita en hacer cosas que le muestran al mundo la superioridad tecnológica. Y si vemos que recién hoy, con la tecnología que fue avanzando, se está empezando a pensar que en poco tiempo ya la minería espacial va a ser rentable, porque bueno, Elon Musk, los cohetes reutilizables, pensar que en la época de la NASA vos salías con un cohete y el cohete quedaba en el espacio, y después, si reentraba en órbita, se hacía mierda en algún lado, ¿no? Era un montón de guita que cada vez que tirabas algo en órbita lo perdías. Y bueno, y la explicación más simple es que, mirá, no había incentivos políticos para meterle más guita al tema. No había tampoco un incentivo económico, porque no daba la ecuación para estar yendo a la Luna por minerales que te iba a salir más IR que lo que ibas a poder venderlos. Todavía no había, digamos, la utilización de ciertos minerales como ahora para baterías, para un montón de componentes electrónicos, ¿no? Recién está explotando todo eso. La era de la computación, los microchips, las plaquetas y demás. Entonces, bueno, la explicación oficial es esa. Después tenés un montón de otras explicaciones que ya van más a lo que tiene que ver con las teorías conspirativas, ¿no? Hay una, por ejemplo, de un chabón que se llama Billy Thompson, que, bueno, tiene credenciales de que ha laburado en el gobierno de Estados Unidos, en inteligencia naval o algo así. El chabón decía que cuando el hombre llegó a la Luna se encontró con extraterrestres y reptilianos que básicamente generaron que el hombre no vuelva a la Luna, porque la Luna es una base extraterrestre de control sobre la Tierra, y que por eso no volvimos, porque lo tenemos prohibido. Por lo mismo que no se volvió a lanzar una bomba atómica, porque lo tenemos prohibido de alguna manera por estos seres, ponele. Otra de las teorías es que en realidad nunca se llegó a la Luna, que es la que vamos a explorar hoy, sino que fue todo hecho en un set de televisión para ganarle la carrera espacial a la Unión Soviética y quedar ante el mundo como los campeones sin tener que gastar la guita ni arriesgarse a lo que estaban haciendo, que venían fracasando, ¿no?, en esa carrera. Hoy vamos a explorar esa posibilidad, que es la más, digamos, mainstream de todas, ¿no? No la de los extraterrestres, sino que fue fingido y que sobre todo se basa en que era una época en los Estados Unidos, de la de Nixon y todo eso, que era muy manipulada la opinión pública, se le mentía mucho a la gente, y bueno, todo lo que vino, ¿no? Antes el asesinato de Kennedy y todo lo que pasó después con el Watergate y todas las mentiras en Vietnam y demás. Entonces, hoy vamos a ver un poco este documental. Este documental supuestamente no, para la gran mayoría, es el documental que más evidencia tiene y hecho por el experto más importante en la teoría conspirativa sobre la llegada a la Luna, y no es el video prohibido de Silvina, que se hizo allá por el 2000 y pico, si bien
no lo tengo mal. Vamos a chequearlo por las dudas en un segundillo. En el 2001, sí. Este documental se estrenó en el 2001 y es de Bart SIBREL. Que bueno, es este chabón que hace poco estuvo en Joe Rogan, por eso todo este tema es como medio mainstream otra vez. Y bueno, y después vamos a tener al astrofísico, que es el Dr. Brian Keating, que bueno, hace todo como una explicación científica y te muestra toda la evidencia y de alguna manera es como que hace un debunking del documental que vamos a ver primero. Entonces vamos a ver, sí, era en el 69, pensé que me estaban jodiendo con la fecha por otra cosa. Así que bueno, vamos a primero ver el documental de Brian SIBREL, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. Y después vamos a ver, ¿no?, la refutación del astrofísico. ¿Cómo le gusta joderte con los sonidos, Vamos.
Since the beginning of recorded history, the human race has been at war. First with members of their own family, then their fellow countrymen, and finally nations at large. Yet perhaps the starting ground for all these conflicts lays somewhere deeper, within the very character of the human condition, in the dark, untouchable crevices of the human heart. It is said that the first iniquity of free will began even before the maiden pilgrimage from the embryo, preceding the very creation of the earth itself, in the forelife of souls in the heavenly realms. The dawn of warfare, some believe, was initiated by a fallen angel, whose trespass against God was pride. In ancient Babylonia, in an age so long ago that the exact millennium remains in question, the Tower of Babel began construction. It was to be the single greatest achievement of the human race. A tower so tall that its summit would reach the heavens, and by it prove to the world that their race was superior. It would be God's irony that it would never be finished.
La voy a probar, Ramiro.
Time passed, nations fell, a machine age emerged, and once again the ingenuity of the species which held dominion over all others unveiled what was at the time the most monumental accomplishment ever imagined, the largest machine yet constructed. An automation so mammoth and so revered, even before its first demonstration, that its only befitting name was Titanic. On April 10th, 1912, it set sail. It was boasted to be the ship that God himself could not sink. It would be God's irony that the very element that was meant to keep it afloat would cause it to sink. Water, frozen water, in the form of an iceberg. Not even one voyage did it complete. And then the next age embarked into the annals of human history, perhaps the last age, the space age. Competition for victor was unparalleled. Powerful nations spent billions in unabashed rivalry to outdo the other. The Soviet Union launched the first orbiting satellite, the first animal, the first man, They had logged 500% more hours in space than the United States. And in June of 1969, they launched an unmanned probe to the moon to retrieve the first soil sample from another world, just 1 month before Apollo 11. That's how close the race was. Had their unmanned probe not crash-landed into the lunar surface, the first moon rock brought back to Earth would have been by the Soviet Union.
The
Richard
Soviets.
Nixon, president at the time, had this to say about the latest work of the human hand. It is the greatest week since creation, the greatest event since the laying of the foundation of the seas, since the origin of the universe itself, since the design and formation of the delicate human eye,
Hace calor
through
acá,
which
Facu.
all these things are perceived, was a flying machine with its 2 passengers, landing on its closest celestial neighbor and returning from where it came. Perhaps again, God's irony lies somewhere within this great boast of humankind.
Es muy loco, ¿no? Que algo que en su momento, en los 70, para toda la humanidad fue algo grandioso, me imagino, para la gente de esa época, ver que el hombre llegaba a la luna. Era como ver que la tecnología, la ciencia, la modernidad tenía todo el futuro para ofrecerte, ¿no? Se hablaba de colonizar la luna, de viajes espaciales, ¿no? Toda la ciencia ficción explotaba en ese momento. Y que algo que es el mayor logro de la humanidad, ¿no? Hoy en día, después de tanto tiempo, siga siendo tan... se dude tanto, ¿no? De si lo hicimos o no. Y es porque es una hazaña tan grande que es imposible creerlo, porque vemos en el quilombo que vemos hoy de tanta estupidez por todos lados, que decir, ¿cómo la humanidad o un grupo de gente se puede organizar para hacer tamaña hazaña si hoy en día no se pueden organizar para solucionar problemas más simples en la Tierra, ¿no? O tiene que ver que desconfiamos hoy en día tanto de nuestros políticos, nos han mentido tanto por tanto tiempo, que vos decís, no le creo nada, no le creo ni la llegada a la luna, porque ¿cómo le voy a creer a Nixon? ¿Cómo le voy a creer al gobierno de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Que me ha mentido durante tanto tiempo invadiendo y haciendo distintas cosas? Por eso me parece interesante que veamos el documental y después lo que dice un astrofísico y que muestre la evidencia, ¿no? Para que cada uno se quede con la idea que quiera.
Building of the tallest tower for the sole purpose of standing out among the races was never finished. The machine that was so great that it was said to be untouchable by even God never completed its first voyage.
Se me fue para atrás.
And newly discovered 2 decades crowning achievement of the sole purpose of standing out among the races was never finished. The machine that was so great, and finally, the crowning achievement of humankind, the greatest boast of the species, the event in human history most associated with pride in our own accomplishments, landing on the moon. 20 years later, and years behind schedule, the same space program couldn't put into Earth orbit a telescope with a lens that focused. And yet 2 decades earlier, a mission 100 times more complicated worked on its first occasion. With close scrutiny of the motives of the zealous Nixon administration, a critical examination of the entirely government-controlled press coverage, and newly discovered footage of the crew of Apollo 11 staging part of their mission, we wish to detail what may come to be the greatest government conspiracy of all time. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon.
We'll have a lovely afternoon, kiss the world goodbye, and away we'll fly. Destination moon. We'll travel fast as a light till we're out of sight. The earth will be like a toy balloon. Oh, what a thrill you'll get riding on my jet. A destination moon. Oh, we'll go up, 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 up. Straight to the moon we two. Oldsmobile, a supersonic, a honeymoon. Leave your cares below, pull the switch, let's go. A destination moon.
O sea, igual súper tendencioso, ¿no? Porque si yo te muestro todas las pruebas que hizo Elon Musk en SpaceX antes de llegar a tirar un cohete, también están explotando todas, ¿no? Pero bueno, vamos. Obviamente que es tendencioso, pelados. Este es un documental de que no fueron a la luna.
We'll be high in the starry blue. I'll be out of this world with you. So away we'll steal in my jetmobile. A supersonic, a honeymoon. Leave your cares below. Pull that switch, let's go. Destination. We're flying high up in the sky. Destination, destination moon.
Dr. von Braun, how would you say we stand in relation to the Russians, and do you think we can ever catch up?
I'm convinced that in the space field, the Russians are ahead of us, particularly in large weightlifting capability, and that at the moment the problem is not so much to catch up, but first build up the world.
Este es Von Braun, el jefe de la NASA, un nazi responsable de los cohetes B-2 de la Alemania de esa época, que era el mayor experto en el tema. Lo habían traído con la operación Paperclip, que trajeron a todos los mejores científicos que se lo disputaban con la Unión Soviética.
Working speed that they have already demonstrated. After we are running as fast as they do, there's still a considerable gap to close, and only the future will tell whether we'll manage to close that gap.
We cannot and will not ever get into this race as we should, so long as all of our objectives are short-term objectives. We've got to have no finite end to our objectives. The end of our objectives should be as far as we can see at any given time. But right now, we need a 10 to 12-year program that has as its ultimate goal the manned domination of space. And if we don't, we're going to be in trouble.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
We must assure our preeminence in the peaceful exploration of outer space, focusing on an expedition to the moon in this decade.
T-minus 60 seconds and counting. We passed T-minus 60. 55 seconds and counting. Neil Armstrong reported back when he received the good wishes. Thank you very much. We know it will be a good flight. Good luck and Godspeed. 40 seconds away from the Apollo 11 liftoff. All the second stage tanks now pressurized. 35 seconds and counting. We are still go with Apollo 11. 30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
Ahí claramente está la crítica, ¿no? De todo lo que pasaba en el mundo al mismo tiempo, que se gastaba un montón de guita en esto, ¿no?
Unbeknownst to the citizenry, high above the Earth, beginning at an altitude of 1,000 miles and extending an additional 25,000 miles, lay lethal bands of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts. Every space mission in history with humans on board, from both the United States and Soviet Union, from the first in 1961 to the present, has been well below this deadly radiation field. Mercury, Gemini, Soyuz, Skylab, the Space Shuttle, all maintained altitudes well below 1,000 miles. All except Apollo. The more experienced Soviets spent 100 hours in space for every 20 hours of the US. In order to survive the hour-and-a-half journey...
El tema de estos anillos de Van Allen, esta radiación que está en la Tierra en forma como de dona, ¿no? Es como... lo que siempre dicen los que teorizan de que el hombre llegó a la luna, de que es imposible cruzarlos sin morirte por la radiación, que para cruzarlos tenés que salir por cierto sector y acá te dicen que ni salieron por ahí. Ahora vamos.
Through this radiation field necessary to reach the moon and return, solid lead shielding between the astronauts and the exposure outside would be required. The mammoth Saturn V rocket used by Apollo was already 35 stories tall and weighed as much as a battleship. To add additional tonnage in the form of a lead barrier completely surrounding the crew members would have made it impossible for the vehicle to get off the ground. That is why the Soviets, though more advanced, only sent an unmanned probe to the moon. The Apollo spacecraft's narrowest shielding was less than 1/8 of an inch of light aluminum. In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes. As a result, CNN issued the following report, noting NASA's unpredicted surprise. The radiation belt surrounding Earth may be more dangerous for spacewalking astronauts than previously believed. Scientists say the phenomena known as the Van Allen belts can spawn killer electrons when the Earth's magnetic field changes. These electrons that are being studied could have an important effect, not only on satellites, which has happened in the past, but could also affect the astronauts by creating large doses of radiation that could influence their health. The electrons can penetrate through various materials, including spacesuits, and can pass through, in fact, the walls of the space station, and can create high charges deep inside of these objects. President Kennedy, a man of political, not scientific background, set the irrevocable goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, just days after America's first astronaut had spent a mere 16 minutes in space, not even achieving a single orbit around the Earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
We take an additional risk by making it in full view of the world. But as shown by the feat of astronaut Shepard, this very risk enhances our stature when we are successful.
The technology necessary to launch the massive Saturn V rocket and an intercontinental ballistic missile is 95% similar. When the Soviet Union launched mankind's first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, there was grave concern that they had mastered space ahead of the United States and might use this advantage to launch a first nuclear strike from an orbit high above North America. When they also put the first animal in space, then the first man in space, then achieved the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, and the first ever of 2 simultaneously orbiting spacecrafts, Concern turned to fear and then horror as America watched their communist enemy achieve all these firsts with no hope in sight of ever catching up.
President, a member of Congress said today that he was tired of seeing the United States second to Russia in the space field. I suppose he speaks for a lot of others. What is the prospect that we will catch up with Russia and perhaps surpass Russia in this field?
However tired anybody may be, and no one is more tired than I am, it is a fact that it's going to take some time, and I think we have to recognize it. They secured these large boosters, which have led to their being first in Sputnik and led to their first putting their man in space. We are, I hope, going to be able...
Aparte, imagínate, después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, ¿no? Que estas dos potencias están, digamos, compitiendo por mostrarle al mundo qué sistema es mejor, mostrando más tecnología, más bienestar, lo que sea, ¿no? Cada uno con su propaganda también. Vos fijate que en la época era algo de lo que se hablaba en conferencia, que le preguntaban al presidente, digamos, era algo que en la opinión pública, porque también estaba el peligro de esto de la guerra nuclear, ¿no? Si los guachines llegaban al espacio y vos no, y te podían tirar bombas nucleares desde el espacio con misiles o controlar el espacio, era estratégicamente una pérdida muy grande. Había como mucha presión, evidentemente, también por el tema.
Carry out our efforts with due regard to the problem of the life of the man involved this year, but we are behind.
If it was impossible to better the Soviets in the space race, which was really a race of technological armaments, what could be done? How could America offset the threat of superior weaponry? Throughout the history of rivalry and war, astute generals of lesser armies than their counterparts have used deceit and misinformation as a method to achieve victory. In World War II, for example, columns of inflatable tanks were placed at locations afar from Normandy to draw German forces away from the real location of invasion. The Star Wars missile defense program rigged tests to make it seem more advanced than it really was. That's the conclusion of the General Accounting Office. The aim was to fool the Soviet Union about US military readiness during the Cold War. Certainly, it was not possible to fool just the Soviets about US strategic capability in the 1960s, while somehow informing 200 million Americans of the truth secretly. In order for them to believe the United States had the capability to go to the moon, everyone would have to believe it. Furthermore, the pride of a nation was at stake, and the goal of a martyr, not to mention the growing unrest domestically of a government throwing tens of thousands of lives away in a foreign war riddled with contradiction and ambiguity. In addition, the Apollo program had already spent billions of dollars. If it failed to achieve its goal with such an investment, it would indeed be a large and bitter pill for the taxpayers to swallow. The cost of the program, whose sole goal was to be the first to plant a flag on the lifeless rock just outside the Earth, if adjusted for inflation to the 21st century, was $135 billion. With a profit margin of just 7%, this would be equal to over $9 billion profit going to the privileged contractors chosen by their friends at NASA. If the machinery was in fact only achieving Earth orbit, as other earlier missions had already done, then the completion and functionality of the other components would not have been as important, and even more profit would have been made.
Hasta ahora el documental hace un buen trabajo mostrándote todos los incentivos que tenían como para que salga bien, lo peligroso que era que salga mal, y lo importante que era poder mostrarle a su población y al mundo que podían llegar, ¿no? En ese sentido el documental te muestra claramente o hace un buen trabajo mostrándote que no podían fallar, ¿no? Lo que hace, empieza a ser más creíble su narrativa de que no llegaron y que lo fakearon.
$135 billion could feed 2 million people for their entire lives. It could also buy 2 million two-bedroom houses. Yet how could such an undertaking be kept sacred, and for such a long time? To the latter, one needs only to remember that an unsolved riddle, 6 years older, the assassination of President Kennedy, still daunts the minds of the vast majority of Americans. As a parent of a conspiracy, as his assassin being assassinated himself, the truth of the matter has still escaped history. In keeping a secret of the magnitude of the Apollo missions being fraudulently created, one turns to the Manhattan Project for comparison. Surreptitiously building the first nuclear bomb during the early to mid-1940s involved 129,500 people over a 3-year period. Yet the secret did not get out. A quarter century later, the art and technology of espionage inevitably improved, narrowing dramatically the number of players in the know of a large clandestine operation. Just 1 year before the first mission to the moon, NASA launched the Tetra satellite, specifically designed to simulate flight data coming from the moon, so that the ground crews could rehearse the landing, much as the astronauts did in their own simulations. Had it not supposedly fallen back to Earth, all that would have been needed during the actual flight would be a repeat of one of these computer programs, with a few original variations, transmitted to the satellite for rebroadcast to Houston. Scores of computers and their deceived operators on the ground would then receive prearranged information, including the alleged location, altitude, and fuel consumption of the spacecraft, as if it were descending to the moon's surface. If the Soviets tried to find the actual location of an Apollo crew in the hundreds of thousands of miles surrounding the Earth and the moon, it would be tantamount to trying to find a rowboat in the Atlantic Ocean. The fact that the Apollo program was so departmentalized, with various construction and test sites around the country, meant that only a few people saw the whole picture. And for the first time ever, there was no independent press coverage of such an historical event. Whatever pictures and sound were distributed to the public were strictly controlled and previewed by the federal government. They were then disseminated unchecked until this hour. For who would realize that the unthinkable was not only possible, but absolutely true? And what of the photographs? What do they tell us? On 3 separate occasions, our office asked NASA's Public Relations Department for every single picture of an astronaut on the surface of the moon, just during the maiden voyage of Apollo 11. Many duplicates were sent.
Bicho dice, Pela, ¿no crees en el alunizaje? Mira, antes dudaba, hoy creo que, o sea, que lo más probable es que hayamos llegado. Pero te respondo cuando terminemos el programa. Ahora vamos a ver el de este documental, que es el mejor, digamos, que tiene como la evidencia o que tiene el planteo, digamos, más interesante, y después vamos a ver la refutación de un astrofísico que habla exclusivamente de todo lo que dice este BART SIBREL, que es el que hizo el documental, y veremos a ver qué onda. A ver, ¿a quién le creemos más, guachines? Por ejemplo, esto que acaba de decir recién, yo no me acordaba y no lo sabía, que la NASA sacó este satélite que lo que hacía era retransmitir data para simular que estaban yendo a la Luna. Eso me hace dudar un toque, ¿no? Pero bueno, estás viendo un documental que está tratando de decirte que la llegada a la Luna es falso, o sea que va a agarrar las cosas y te lo va a tratar de contar dentro de su narrativa. Por eso es importante ver cómo lo refuta el otro. Mirá quién llegó, ahí llegó el ruso imperial, viene llorando con boquita.
Found, including first-hand investigation on site at the agency's vaulted archives. Quite surprising, considering the historical significance of the event. These very photographs are the same ones circulated year after year on anniversary commemorations. It is estimated that in just the first 60 minutes on the moon, motivated by the tenuous nature of the circumstances, many more exposures could have been expediently taken. Also surprising is the scarcity of photographs of the mission's chief pioneer, Neil Armstrong. The greatest achievement in human history, and of the man whose first step echoed around the world, dawning a new age of scientific enlightenment, there is only one full-body picture of him on the moon, besides this ghostly reflection. This one. taken by an automatic camera mounted on the side of the lunar module. Perhaps he feared liability should the whole conundrum later become unraveled. Perhaps he has forgotten that he attested to the authenticity of the event with his signature on this plaque engraved by the federal government. In fact, in the more than 30 years since the event, aside from NASA's initial press conference and the occasional brief anniversary remarks where few questions were permitted, he has never given one on-camera interview to anyone, ever. From an analytical standpoint, photographic anomalies have to be sought out with an understanding of lighting and shadows. The most straightforward is simple. When objects are lit solely by the sun, as all the scenes on the moon were said to be, after all, lighting equipment was not only impractical, it was unnecessary in bright sunlight, then all shadows, regardless of the landscape, will run parallel with one another and never intersect, as shown by this example. In these seldom seen photographs, obtained from a rarely used auxiliary NASA archival site, it is clear that these scenes were lit with artificial light.
Bueno, esto que ya dice acá, esto es cuestionable. Yo no veo tan diferente esta sombra de esta, o sea, hay diferencia de tamaños, hay diferencia de alturas en el terreno. Esto es un stretch.
It is clear that these scenes were lit with artificial light. These shadows, which are cast at different angles, are evidence that a second light source is being used.
Y este tampoco me parece tan diferente. Si bien este tiene un poco más de sentido el ángulo, también hay que ver, digamos, si el palo ese, si yo estoy parado acá y el palo ese está así, tiene sentido que esté en un ángulo. Pero si yo estoy parado así y el palo este está acá, va a tener una sombra distinta, no sé cómo afecta, ¿no? Puede tener un ojo de pez también y meter que todas las sombras que están acá te las manda para adentro. No parecería en la foto, pero bueno, no lo sabemos. Esto, lo de la foto y la sombra, me parece lo más pelotudo de la discusión.
In addition, the sun would not cause an isolated hotspot like this, only an artificial light would. Again, intersecting shadows and another hotspot. And again. And again. It is simply impossible for this picture to have been taken.
Este es raro, ¿no? Porque tiene como si estuviera completamente del otro lado. Pero si vos te fijas en esas rocas, tiene como la sombra de este lado. Eso es extraño.
With sunlight on the moon. Here, the shadows are shown to be as black as pitch. And yet here, completely in a shadow, the astronaut is lit up like a Christmas tree. How can this be?
Eso no, dale, Jojo, ¿cómo puede ser eso? Eso tiene que ver con la exposición de la foto. Acá tranquilamente te das cuenta que el piso de la luna es medio reflectivo. Y claramente, por más que acá estés en sombra, algo va a reflectar sobre un traje blanco y ese tipo de cosas.
The astronaut is lit up like a Christmas tree. How can this be? Or this.
Y aparte pueden haber tenido algún tipo de lucellos también, qué sé yo.
On the shadow side of the lunar module. In this magnification of an Apollo photograph, a rock, very likely a papier-mâché prop because of the crease here, is categorized with the letter C. In later releases of the same picture, the letter is gone, probably airbrushed out. Here, a crosshair, which was burned directly into the image from the film plate, and thus should always appear on top of the objects in the photograph, appears behind the object in this scene, clearly revealing a composite of two pictures into one. Someone apparently forgot to create a burn crater underneath the lunar module's 10,000-pound thrust engine, despite the fact that during ground tests there was a real concern for the vehicle falling into the hole the engine created as it descended. Here is a Norman Rockwell depiction drawn just 2 years earlier based on the latest specifications and scientific data. In these enlargements, it looks as though the lunar module was simply placed there.
¿Eso qué tiene que ver? Tranquilamente puede ser distinto a lo que pensaban la superficie lunar.
Not even one speck of moon dust on the landing pod. As a result, all subsequent flights had to have the same discrepancy, which was explained away by the effect of no atmosphere. And what about stars? On the moon with
Y lo
no
de las estrellas es lo más boludo de todo, amigo. No sabe cómo funciona la exposición de una cámara. No vas a ver las estrellas si estás exponiendo para sacar una foto a los astronautas. Es imposible.
atmosphere, they must have been quite a sight to behold. Yet there is seldom any mention of them, if ever, by any of the astronauts on any of the missions. Undoubtedly creating a mural with all the constellations properly placed.
Y después lo que estoy pensando es, por las distintas focos de luz, a ver, como vos acá la luna refracta algo de luz a la noche, tal vez la Tierra refracta algo de luz hacia la luna, no tanto obviamente como el Sol, pero no sé si generará algún papel, qué sé yo. Cuando esté con Juliano le voy a preguntar. Después tengo un astrofísico ahora después que hace toda una refutación sobre este documental. Y va como punto por punto, te va mostrando la evidencia y qué sé yo.
Placed in the sky would have been virtually impossible to create accurately, much less realistically. A competent amateur astronomer would have been able to call attention to the slightest error in measurement. The answer? Not to talk about the stars. Ever.
Y ahí es lo que me hace sospechar, ¿entendés? Que el documental es muy una serie de cosas que agarra y se construyen a realidad. Porque es muy fácil probar el tema de por qué no se ven las estrellas. Es solamente entender cómo funciona una cámara y cómo funciona la exposición de una cámara. Y en esa época aparte, ¿no? Ni siquiera eran cámaras digitales que podía jugar con varias exposiciones, ¿entendés? Entonces que no haya investigado eso y lo ponga como una evidencia me hace pensar que el resto de las cosas tampoco las investigó tanto, ¿no?
In their post-flight press conference, it was the only question to which Neil Armstrong responded with an absence of memory.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Years later, though, Michael Collins would remember seeing the elusive stars and wrote about them in Expeditions to the Moon. It seems his memory improved the older he got. Why don't stars appear in any of the photographs? Simply because the proper, mostly closed exposure setting for the camera's iris, set that way to compensate for the bright sunlight on the moon's surface, completely diminished the faintness of...
Y después también, a ver, los astronautas no son fotógrafos. Yo, por ejemplo, el otro día estaba buscando en ChatGPT que me diga, che, pasame las fotos de la Tierra desde la Luna de la NASA. Me muestra una que es esa Blue Marble y supuestamente hay 4 o 5 más y no me pudo dar un link que me las muestre. De la NASA todo roto, los links, no pude verlo, no lo pude ver. Y viste, le puse a ChatGPT, che, me parece medio raro que no me pueda mostrar las 3, 4 fotos más importantes de la humanidad. ¿Me estás jodiendo? Lo que eso lo hace sospechoso, ¿no? Pero bueno, los chabones no son fotógrafos. Llevaron equipos que evidentemente se manejaban más o menos automáticamente o que habían aprendido más o menos cómo usarlo. Vos me decís, che, van a la luna y no pueden aprender cómo usar una cámara. Puede ser, pero vos sabés la cantidad de cosas que estos chabones tenían que estar mirando, controlando. Estás en la luna, amigo.
Relatively distant specks of diminutive light. This answer is true. It does not, however, explain why they never took any pictures of the stars by themselves, with an exposure setting perfect for them. While they took 3 automobiles to the moon, they never took a photographic telescope. Had they done so, they would have been able to see farther into the universe than had ever before been realized. If they had taken a telescope and were not actually on the moon, they would have had to concoct undiscovered galaxies that might one day prove to be non-existent. The cost of the 3 moon rovers in 21st century currency? Nearly $60 million each, though they had fewer parts than a Jeep. Where was all this money going? Then there's the flag, blowing in the wind, at least twice, on the atmosphereless moon. We can only guess that most of the missions were staged inside for fear of possible aerial or satellite reconnaissance from an unfriendly nation. The backpacks, designed for 1/6 gravity.
Pero si estaban adentro, ¿por qué se movía con el viento? No había viento dentro de un estudio, boludo. Es ridículo, no entiendo esto.
Must have had the cooling systems removed to allow for movement without falling over. With very near and hot studio lighting, that left one hot astronaut inside. Assuming that it was the astronauts inside, after all, their faces were always covered. The necessary mammoth amounts of air conditioning were probably responsible for the air current. Here the editor cuts to a still shot of the flag, just as the effect becomes noticeable. Here it is unchecked. This rare clip, attained decades ago, was never re-released with the inevitable increase in experience and scrutiny.
Me parece raro también que si te fakeaste esto, no puedes apagar los ventiladores cuando tenés que poner la bandera. Para mí tiene que haber otra explicación. Vamos a ver la explicación del astrofísico.
To demonstrate 1/6 gravity, a bouncy, floaty feel to the astronauts' movements would be similarly achieved with relative simplicity. Slow motion. You are viewing the scenes as they aired more than 30 years ago. Now let's look at them with the speed doubled. It becomes discernible that they are, in fact, in Earth's gravity, and are no more leaving the ground than they would on Earth. It is clear from these rarely seen color television pictures that the crew of Apollo 11 brought a high-resolution color video camera with them on their mission, yet the only pictures broadcast live from the moon's surface were these from a low-definition black and white camera. In fact, the networks complained because in addition to this, they were forced to shoot the images, second generation, off of a projection TV of the technology of 30 years ago, and were not even allowed to take a direct feed, which further degraded the quality and clarity of the images. Perhaps this was precisely what NASA and the federal government had in mind. After all,
sí, también puede ser, vos podés tener una cámara ya de a color, 4K y qué sé yo, pero si no tenés la tecnología para mandar un feed casi en vivo, ¿no? No podés mandar esa fidelidad. Tal vez se ve choto porque la señal tenía que volver en baja calidad para volver más o menos rápido y que llegue en un archivo que podías abrir, o que la señal que puedas transmitir, digamos, ¿no? Me parece que eso, hay algunas cosas que son medias boludas.
it was a first, regardless of where they were. Better to open up their debut mission with fuzzy pictures and numerous blackouts, rather than show too much revealing detail of a false scene that was yet unproven. And finally, the element that seals their fate. Of all the footage of Apollo 11 requested from NASA over a 5-year period, one gem was discovered just before the completion of this documentary. An old reel received by mistake. It contains the raw or unedited footage of the crew of Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin Jr. and Neil Armstrong, staging part of their mission for nearly an hour in living color, with exceptionally clear behind-the-scenes audio of conversations discussing the techniques used to achieve a disingenuous picture depicting the Earth at a distance, in order to falsely demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. It cannot be misconstrued that this staging was done for some other reason prior to the mission, for the reel itself is slated and dated July 18th, 19th and 20th, 1969, the very days of the mission when they were said to be approaching and achieving lunar orbit. Furthermore, it is apparent they are in genuine zero gravity aboard the actual spacecraft, necessary to convince the mass media of their authenticity, just not any further than Earth orbit, as you will see. In this never-before-seen or heard footage, not only is the radio conversation between the astronauts and Houston Control audible, there is a secondary, private conversation taking place between the crew and a third confidential party, prompting the astronauts with what to say, when to speak, and how to effectively manipulate the camera to achieve the desired misleading effect. NASA claims that the Houston transmissions were the only ones taking place with the astronauts. Listen now as Houston Control initiates a conversation with the crew, only to find them too preoccupied with the behind-the-scenes trickery to respond. Moments pass and the oversight is picked up on by the clandestine third party, who quickly prompts them with talk. Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger, we're wrapping in on Earth.
Acá lo que van a mostrar, que esta muestra que hicieron de la Tierra cuando fue la transmisión, que termina siendo fraudulenta, porque en realidad lo que hicieron fue apagar las luces de la nave y filmar como la ventanita para generar esta, y ahora se va a ver porque es como que en un momento lo terminan como mostrando, se nota que los chabones están ahí adentro y que fue como medio fue chamullo. Y aparte no creo que la Tierra se vea tan chiquita desde la Luna, o sea, ¿no? Vos pensás que la Tierra, no sé, es como no sé cuántas cantidad de veces más grande de la Luna, pero una cantidad de veces abismal, y vos la Luna la ves grande, me imagino que la Tierra de la Luna se tiene que ver gigante, boludo.
The illusion they are attempting to create is the Earth at a distance to demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. Understand, too, that only about 20 seconds of this raw footage was ever broadcast to the public, and these conversations discussing their deception were believed to be private until now. Here they discuss that these television
Ahí dice Matías, 6.700 kilómetros de radio tiene la Tierra y la Luna está a 300.000 kilómetros. ¿Y cuánto tiene de radio la Luna?
transmissions were in fact
110 veces el diámetro de la Luna.
Not broadcast live as everyone believed. They were first screened and edited for playback later.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get to playback, we can sort of correlate what we were seeing. Thank you very much.
Here they discuss the fact that they have turned out the lights and have blocked out sunlight from entering the spacecraft through the other windows as to not cause any reflected light to fall onto the spacecraft's wall in the foreground.
Okay, very good. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light.
The reason this was done is so that the truth of the matter would not be revealed. It is this. Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground, outside of which it is completely filled with the Earth in low orbit. The circumference of the window then appears to be the diameter of the Earth at a distance, with the darkened walls of the spacecraft appearing to be the blackness of space around it. That is why they wanted the interior dark and blocked out the sun from entering through the other windows. Here you can see the extruded window, probably 2 inches thick at the bottom. This is because the Earth's shine is coming in at a downward angle. It also causes the Earth to appear to be an irregularly shaped circle, for you are seeing the outside of the window at the bottom and the inside of the window at the top, which together form 2 different sized halves of a circle. Subsequently, this take was never used. As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day. It is uncannily convincing. During this segment, intended to be edited and played back later for the worldwide television audience, dated July 18, 1969, Neil Armstrong condemns himself as he states that he is 130,000 miles out, or halfway to the moon, as the NASA flight log also states on this date, when he is in reality in low Earth orbit of a few hundred miles.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11.
calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Here, during another segment, also intended to air after review, Neil Armstrong falsely explains to the viewers how the shot is attained by putting the camera's lens to the window's glass, as it would have to be if they were the claimed distance away from the Earth.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with a TV camera.
If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the Terminator or inside the shadow.
Eso puede ser un brazo, puede ser la mano del chabón que la metió por adelante. ¿Cómo sé que es un brazo, amiga?
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
Blue gas, see white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth. And
this is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey away? Furthermore, if they genuinely went to the moon, why would they be faking any part of it? Why this trickery with the window? By faking being halfway to the moon, it becomes apparent that they did so because they could not even go halfway. It thus confirms that the stumbling block to their success was the lethal radiation of the Van Allen radiation belts. Since the same equipment was used on the subsequent missions in the 40 months that followed, none of them could have gone to the moon. They only increased their proficiency at staging them. When some TV viewers of the second manned mission to the moon telephoned the networks complaining that reruns of I Love Lucy were being interrupted, it became clear that for the taxpayers, once was enough. But it wasn't enough for the government and contractors. Billions of dollars of pure profit went with each return. How coincidental that the following mission would have the element of life and death jeopardy. Apollo 13. Now the public would take going to the moon more seriously and be reconnected with the drama. We now realize that perhaps the reason Neil Armstrong has never given an on-camera interview is because he doesn't want to lie anymore. What threats may have been made upon such honorable men or their families to possess their reluctant cooperation and later ill feelings towards perpetuating this still darkened hour in American history? NASA's highest-ranking official, James Webb, resigned without explanation just days before the first Apollo mission. Why, when he was on the threshold of achieving the greatest accomplishment of his career? All 3 Apollo 11 astronauts also resigned shortly after their return. On the 25th anniversary of the event in 1994, Neil Armstrong made a rare public appearance and held back tears as he spoke these brief cryptic remarks before the next generation of taxpayers as they toured the White House.
Today we have with us a group of students among America's best. To you we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
He is that layer. Perhaps someday soon, with the uncovering of this footage and its meaning, the true patriots of America will rise up or come forward and free the citizens and themselves from the sin that so easily entangles and from a federal government that needs to have the gangrene cut off. Even if the government's destruction would come from the truth, then it is not worthy to stand, and its betterment would inevitably follow. All of us are mortal. All of us will die. Perhaps the seeking of a clear conscience before that hour will motivate the truth into the light. Perhaps as citizens we should offer
Bueno, acá ya no dicen todas boludeces, ¿no? Bueno, y ahora vamos a pasar a ver al astrofísico, el doctor Brian Keating, que bueno, es un astrofísico conocido, que bueno, va a refutar este documental y todas las teorías de este guachín, en específico BART SIBREL. Así que vamos con esto, guachines.
In 1969, Apollo 11 was the first manned mission to land on the moon. Or was it? In recent weeks, we've seen Tucker Carlson, Patrick Bet-David, and Joe Rogan and Bart Sibrel discuss conspiracy theories suggesting that the moon landing was a fake. It really pisses me off. NASA's the only thing we all should agree upon that's a net good for Americans and the whole world. In NASA's footage, you can clearly see the flag waving, even though there's no atmosphere in the moon. There are also no stars seen in the footage, and the radiation levels in the Van Allen radiation belts surrounding the Earth would have been lethal to the astronauts, since NASA had not developed adequate shielding technology to protect them back then. Right? Wrong. Usually I don't waste my time trying to debunk claims like these, because I don't think such people can be reasoned with. They're not interested in debate. They're interested in sensationalism. But in the recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience featuring notorious conspiracy theorist Bart Sibrel really compelled me to break that rule. Having people like Sibrel cast aspersions on NASA's credibility, historic achievements, and contributions to our safety every time we get on a plane just could not be left aside. That's why today I'm going to systematically debunk Sibrel's claims one by one, explaining the science behind the Apollo 11 mission, and extending an invitation to him to join me on the Joe Rogan Experience for a debate, one-on-one, mano a mano, with a real scientist. Let's go back to the moon.
Some of the claims are so ridiculous that it's impossible to take Sibrel seriously. He keeps referring to electrical light. Electrical light. What the hell does that even mean?
It's electrical light, it's an electrical light, it's an electrical light by electrical light, an electrical light, proving it's an electrical light. It's an electrical light to electrical light. That electrical light, it looks like an electrical light. It can only be done with an electrical light. It's electrical light.
He doesn't even know the terminology of this field, and he's supposed to be a documentary filmmaker. The term is artificial light, or perhaps man-made light. But you're trying to debunk it, you don't even know the terminology. It's kind of pathetic. So instead of just dismissing it right at that, we're going to go through each and every one of these incredible, ridiculous claims that the moon landings were faked. For what purpose? He doesn't really give, except some nebulous things that he's heard from CIA agents and astronauts who he refuses to mention their names, because I guess he's worried about their safety after 50 years. He always says, I brought this footage and these different channels like Fox News wouldn't even publish them because they were afraid that they would be shut down by the government. What?
Y es importante que los científicos empiecen a dar esta discusión. Porque con eso que dijo al principio, no, son tan pelotudos que no hace falta estar hablando de ellos, no se dan cuenta que están dejando libre toda esta nueva forma de comunicación a un montón de guachines que ven cualquier cosa y tiran cualquier fruta y no hay nadie que los refute con algo de autoridad. Entonces está bueno que estos chabones se tomen el trabajo de hacer estos videos para cualquier tipo de público. Vamos a ver si nos puede refutar todo de una manera que quede clarísimo, ¿no? Y que todos los que estamos acá nos vayamos sin ninguna duda.
Big NASA, you're going to have Buzz Aldrin come and stomp a mud hole on you. It's so ridiculous, but let's entertain it as if it's real. And I'm going to bring the science that SIBREL and unfortunately Joe Rogan were completely unwilling to entertain. Have a real scientist on, Joe. I've been on the show before. I gave you a moon rock, for God's sakes. I don't know. Did you smoke it? What'd you do with it, Joe? I even gave you a Mars rock. So the first of his ridiculous claims revolves around the angles of light and shadows on the moon, which is preposterous in many ways. The moon is a complex three-dimensional object. It's also in motion, and here's a depiction made by one of my kids. This is a 3D print of it. It's really cool, and it shows some of the major features, the difference between the light side and the dark side. But the fundamental evidence, quote unquote, attempts to use this term like he's a scientist himself. The fundamental evidence is that the flag seems to be waving, which is a hoax because the wind doesn't exist on the moon's surface, right? Do you think NASA didn't know that? Do you really think that they could get even this rocket to go in space? I don't think SIBREL denies the fact that the rocket actually left the Earth's surface. And the astronauts were not only gone for more than a week off the Earth's surface, the cameras on Earth, independent countries around the world, our enemies like the Soviet Union and China were tracking this. They had everything to gain by denying what we did, but he has some, of course, explanation for why they would collude with their arch enemy. For what purpose? We don't know. It's not specified, but I guess if you're an expert, conspiracy crackpot, you have some ideas of your own. So there's no wind on the moon's surface, so how could the flag wave? NASA knew this. They installed wires inside the flag to suspend it, so it wouldn't just look like a draping, depleted, flaccid flag. So that's a ridiculous claim to be made. And the fact is, all the moon landings had this feature, so they'd all have to be faked in some sound studio, as SIBREL suggests. So the flag was fitted with a horizontal rod that kept it unfurled, extended. And the waving motion is due to vibrations caused by the astronauts. The surface is so still that objects can remain there for literally millions of years, undisturbed and untested. So any tiny perturbation will cause a great deal of motion. There's no inertia, there's no wind resistance to damp the motion as well. Once the motion started, it kept in position due to the lack of air resistance. This is trivial. This is freshman high school level stuff, Bart. Next, he has some ridiculous claims about the magnetic field of the Earth and that astronauts would be fried going through it in some sense, which is, again, preposterous. The Earth's magnetic field is far, far weaker at the moon's surface, so going to the moon would actually be safer if this preposterous claim were actually true. And if it were true, the astronauts that orbit around the Earth in the ISS, which you can see on almost any given night of the year, depending on where you are on the Earth's surface, they would be irradiated and they would suffer grave consequences unless every single one of the 700 or so astronauts that NASA alone has sent into space, not to mention the Chinese, the Russians, and many other countries as well, and partnership around the globe. It's one of the few areas of life that has cooperation. This is another reason I hate these debunkers and these supposed conspiracy theorists that talk about NASA in such a disparaging light. Again, we have very few examples of international cooperation. The next claim that SIBREL makes in the first few minutes of this clip, a link down below, is that there was a delay in the radio communication that led to suspicions. And he claims it's 12 seconds long, and that he claims shows signs of being tampered or edited or staged.
White crystals. And the thing that I reported as vesicular before, I don't believe I believe that anymore. I think it's small craters. They look like...
First of all, that proves nothing about the truth or falsehood of people landing on the moon's surface. And it's, of course, possible, and it's mandatory for there to be a delay. In fact, it's only a delay of about 1.5 seconds each way, because that's the distance the moon is away, traveling at the speed of light, which is the speed the radio communications travel at. He seems totally ignorant about that. So there's a 3-second approximate round trip time delay, just that's built in, plus the comprehension delay, the time delay when the astronauts are working on the moon's surface for them to think about what they're going to say. And they had stuff that was, there were pre-written down scripts for them to say. Neil Armstrong obviously had a great deal of pressure thinking about what he would say when they first landed on the moon's surface. Tranquility Base, the Eagle has landed, which wasn't prompted from Houston. Houston being where the lunar missions were guided and serviced from the Earth. So this is completely a known phenomenon, and there's no reason to even expect that there wouldn't be a delay. It would be more suspicious if there wasn't a delay. And the delays are consistent between people in low Earth orbit or objects in geosynchronous orbit and then objects in lunar orbit. And he claims this is so ridiculous to believe because NASA hasn't been back. Well, the budget for the moon mission today is about 0.5%. Back in the 1960s, while we were fighting a war against the communist Soviet Union and China and proxy war in Vietnam, this was taking up like 8% of the American budget. So this is a huge, huge cost. And even now, the missions to go back will cost about $1 billion. I'd like to know how Mr. SIBREL would propose to do it in a cheaper fashion. And I'm sure it'd be just as safe and lose no astronauts. And further proof of the fact that it was so expensive and difficult is that there was an 18th mission planned and actually funded and scheduled and so forth throughout NASA. And they canceled it because of essentially lack of interest, even by Apollo 13, as the famous movie depicts. People lost interest in the lunar landings, even after 2 of the successful ones occurred. So let alone having another 6, 7, 8 more, 10 more, hundreds more, as SIBREL seems to suggest. And it was planned to be the mission of the space shuttle to kind of pave the way to go back to the moon. But I also want to point the fact out that we as a species, not me or NASA or anything, went to Antarctica and the South Pole in 1911, 1912. And the conquest of the South Pole was the exact equivalent of going to the moon, but some 50 years earlier. And it was a race for international pride and power and so forth. And even the exploration of the last continent on Earth didn't occur until the 20th century. Just again, 50 years before landing on the moon. So it's quite incredible. But the fact is, we never went back to Antarctica, to the South Pole, for another 50 years. It was almost just before the Apollo missions. This is actually before the Gemini missions in the late 1950s, when not astronauts, but explorers and scientists like me and my colleagues went back to the South Pole. So there's absolutely no reason to suggest that there's a conspiracy or cover-up, or it proves it was impossible because it took another 50 years and we still haven't gone back to the moon. That's exactly what happens in all phases of exploration. It's an incredible source of pride for the national governments and the explorers themselves, and they get to have their names in history. And then human interest is what it is, and people lose interest and it decays very rapidly. So turning from those 3 specious claims already been debunked thoroughly, I haven't even gotten to the most ridiculous evidence, which is his prime feature of evidence, which is the so-called intersecting shadows of light, which proves it has to be electrical light. Electrical light. It sounds so ridiculous, Bart. You should learn the terminology before you basically be clowning yourself on a stage as large as the Joe Rogan Experience. You can cover that up with claims of conspiracy and anything, but you can't cover up your own ignorance about the topic. You never display, you never show how it's possible to get converging shadows. And whenever you have somebody who only criticizes and doesn't seem to believe that there's any evidence that supports the moon landing, you have to be incredibly suspicious. So, of course, it made headlines around the world. Here's a copy of it from the New York Times. This is before I was born. It was gifted to me. And you see a picture of Neil Armstrong. Where the hell were they? And you look at things, and some of his claims are that, oh, the shadows are at a right angle. Well, here's a very good picture showing the shadows are exactly in parallel as you'd see from the actual landing, even according to SIBREL himself. He never brings that up. He only brings up one picture, which is a very close-in shot, which you can't see the full panorama. You can't see the horizon. You have no peripheral view of it. This is just one image of it, and these were taken, this is immediately afterwards. All the shadows are consistent. The approach angle, the timing of the mission, thousands of hours of recording. This is original source material right here. This is very valuable, and it's something that to go back in time to recorrupt. This is on August 1st, 1969. So between August 1969 and July 20th, so it's just a couple of weeks later, they faked all this evidence according to BART. It's so ludicrous, but it has to be pointed out that there are long known about lunatics that do propose these things. Now, also look at the shadows here. These are direct images. This would have to be staged in a conspiracy so expensive to go back and print these things later on. This is within less than 2 weeks after the moon landing itself. It's incredible. And the images show exactly what BART himself claims you would see and that you don't see in 1 or 2 pictures. That's his prime evidence. Next, he talks about the lunar module and how it's designed and tested for the moon's lower gravity and the vacuum, and how they left a camera on the moon's surface to capture the ascent, the stage that where the Eagle itself is blasting back off to join Michael Collins, who is orbiting all by himself, the loneliest man in human history, 50 or 100 miles above the moon's surface. What the hell was he doing? How did he take pictures of them? They never went to the moon. Is it that they didn't land on the moon, so they flew all the way to the moon? They didn't get out of the moon capsule? These are just ridiculous. So the controlled camera from the Earth, they were able to do that. He talks about like a picture left by Gene Cernan, I believe, and they would have decayed. It's so preposterous. These are just like the most trivial things. Oh, they didn't know the temperature of the moon's surface, and they didn't know the variation of it, and it couldn't last. If you took a piece of plastic and left it on the moon's surface, what would happen, even if it was in a vacuum? I have photographic plates that I put into my laboratory vacuum chambers for exposure to different elements and radioactive materials. They last just fine, Bart. Totally ridiculous. In fact, sometimes cooling them stabilizes them. Here's a hint. Making it hotter and heating it up would destroy it faster, but they weren't destroyed, and it was videotaped. And if you went there, you could see it today. So there's a good thing. Hey there, truth seekers. Professor Brian Keating here with my tiny little homework assignment for you. And that's to make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel or follow me on your favorite podcast platform. After some podcast for the right video, Bart, unless you have a cover-up, right? So this is another one of his controversial claims. NASA destroyed equipment. I don't know how NASA doesn't pursue this guy for slander, but it's public domain and so forth. So he claims that they destroyed the equipment and tapes to hide the evidence. That's a conspiracy. Remember, Nixon didn't get impeached because of the crime of Watergate, right, Bart? He got impeached because of the cover-up. So let's look for the cover-up. Oh, this proves a cover-up, the absence of archival footage. Okay, except those archives were actually processed, and the people that processed them and stored them and recovered them were on record for why they did what they did. They had to repurpose some of the telemetry tapes, but not the audio tapes. Those are still confined. In fact, just a few years ago in 2019, in July 2019, they had a replication of the lunar landing as if it was going on Twitter at the exact same time. So you had the audio recordings, you had the transcript of it. They didn't erase any of those at all, and especially from the first Apollo mission, which is the one that you should suspect most of all, right? If you're Bart SIBREL.
Houston, Tranquility Base. Do you have an updated limb weight for us, over? That's affirmative. Stand by on the DAP. All right, DAP pad for you is limb weight 10906, over.
So this was standard practice at the time, even though it's of course true that way more recordings, photos, artifacts have been preserved and are kept under, tight lock and key, except for the fact that they're also available publicly if you have the right credentials, which obviously they wouldn't let Bart SIBREL near. Because he tends to smear people like Edgar Mitchell, who's done more in his heroic life in a minute than Bart seems to have done, except for throw stones, lunar rocks at the Apollo achievements. For what purpose? I don't know. I'm not going to speculate the way that he does. Use your own judgment. So we have tons of samples brought back. They brought a rover there. And I haven't even gotten to the scientific proof. Stay tuned. We're going to get to some of the scientific proof that's incontrovertible, that can't be faked, because it's used to this day and is not only in the form of physical artifacts, it's in the form of scientific data. And no one would rather prove the prevailing narrative wrong more than a scientist. That's how we get our kicks as scientists, is proving that the prevailing wisdom, that Aristotle was wrong.
Bueno, ¿cómo lo ven hasta ahora? Le hizo un buen trabajo el chabón hasta lo que vieron ahora refutando parte de lo que dijo. ¿Les parece que no estuvieron prestando atención y siguen peleándose en el chat? ¿Qué onda?
Wrong, that Newton was wrong, that Galileo was wrong, and even that Einstein could be wrong. And that is, in fact, impelling scientists, including my former colleague Tom Murphy at UC San Diego, to study the position of the moon to millimeter accuracy. What does that have to do with the Apollo landings being faked? Stay tuned. Okay, so SIBREL goes back about 8 to 10 minutes into this clip of the conversation that I have posted down below.
If you type in moon landing fraud, you don't get anything about the fraud. You get 1,000 videos defending, the supposed moon missions. Now, if the moon missions are real, then anyone who says otherwise is an idiot.
He argues that the sheer number of videos defending the moon landing suggests that they were staged. This is a logical fallacy to say that the more people that defend or support a hypothesis tends to add to or detract from its veracity. So as Einstein said, when he was first being attacked by German scientists because he was Jewish, he was being attacked by German scientists saying that his theory of relativity was wrong. And they actually published a pamphlet or a book called 100 Scientists Against Einstein. And Einstein laughed about that. He said, if I was really wrong, it will only take one. And Galileo said a similar thing. The humble reasonings of a single man can overcome the depraved delusions of a maddening of crowds. There's tons and tons of videos and documentaries from the very minute, not even from the minute that it took off, from weeks before, interviews with the family members and visits to their home. And when they landed, they weren't permitted to go back into the public. They actually had to stay quarantined on the aircraft carrier, I think it was the Hornet, for 3 weeks. So can you imagine a week to get to the moon, a day or 3 or 4 days to get to the moon, a day on the moon's surface, and then later it was many, many days, a week, and then going back to the moon another week or half of a week, and then being quarantined. It's almost a month or more than a month of your life, constrained, confined to a space capsule or floating around in the ocean on an aircraft carrier. And these people were thought to have done that because of a great conspiracy. Okay, let's see what that says. So the ongoing public interest in it shows that it's actually more probable that it's a historical event, not a cover-up. You don't say that something didn't happen because there's so much evidence for it. That's a strange form of logic. So I wonder if Bart believes that Kennedy was really assassinated. He probably believes in conspiracies about that, as is their wont. But he would have to deny that it took place because there's so much footage of it. There's a Zapruder film, other films, eyewitness testimony. Maybe it didn't happen because there's so much evidence for it happening. That's a strange form of logic. And again, there's something called the conspiracy number. If this purported hoax was truly a hoax, you would have to have the conspiracy involving not only the astronauts or a few people at NASA, thousands of people in the US government, not only them, their families. And to date, no one's come out and leaked about this. And yet there are people like Patrick Bet-David and Tucker Carlson and maybe even Joe Rogan who are willing to entertain these kind of depraved delusions that this didn't happen. And for what reason, we don't know. It's, to get a bigger budget for NASA, really? NASA's 0.5% of the US budget right now. And to say that it was a failure to go from 8% to 0.5% to dilute it by 16 times represents a grave failure and a miscalculation by these people in power. And yet they haven't come out and said, well, we were wrong. We thought we'd get a lot more money than we actually did. Now I want to turn to the scientific explanations, the actual hard evidence that effectively completely obliterates all of Bart's claims and affirms the authenticity of the moon landings. Not just the testimony of the astronauts and the NASA people and the military crew members that picked them up in the ocean and the impossible to account for missing month of their lives had this conspiracy actually been true. The actual hard data comes from scientists who, by their nature, will not participate in conspiracies willingly. So you'd have to trick all these US scientists. But wait, it's much worse than that. You'd have to trick our enemies, the Soviets, the Chinese, and others. You'd have to trick them into supporting via launching their own space missions and complementary data that confirms the methods and results found by the instruments placed on the lunar surface by Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and all the astronauts that came after, including Edgar Mitchell, who Bart disparages in this interview and says that he's threatening to have him whacked because he left a microphone illegally recording him, apparently when he had an interview with that great man who's responsible for so much of NASA science, but also he's also responsible for creating the sensation known as the overview effect, or popularizing that when he was in space, he realized the fragility of Earth and how it needs to be protected. And he famously said, I'd like to take every congressman up there, show him what I saw, and shake him by his collar and say, look at that, you effing son of a beep. Look at that. You have to protect that. Now, I guess that's a horrible thing, right, Bart? That such a person as Edgar Mitchell would do such a thing as want to convince the government to protect our planet. And this is long before, concerns about climate change or global warming, whatever your bugaboo is. I don't really care. But the fact is, the science done by these scientists, they sent up geologists, Cernan and others, to study the geology of the moon's surface and also to do tests that would enable us to test the theory of relativity on Earth. And these things make it incontrovertible that it actually occurred and that SIBREL, again, is not telling the truth. So in Apollo 12 and 15 and 16 mission, the lunar surface magnetometer was deployed. These were 3 different stations. They were consisting of what's called a triaxial flux gate magnetometer, which measures magnetic flux, which is the product of magnetic field times the area of these little solenoidal type shaped objects. And they're designed to measure the magnitude and temporal time variations of the lunar surface's magnetic field. There were 3 of these, as I said, landed in 3 separate Apollo missions, starting with the first one. The first one was very precious because they didn't actually know if they'd ever get back. If there was some moon virus that was left, on their clothing, and they brought it back, that would be incredibly unfortunate, and we'd probably never go back. And of course, they'd probably die, which they didn't, and they went on to live healthy, happy lives. And as I said earlier in many podcast conversations with my fellow professors, Neil Armstrong proves that being a professor is the best job on Earth, because even after being the first human being in history to actually land on the moon's surface, he could only follow up that job by becoming a professor. So the analysis of the lunar samples brought back are also consistent with the magnetometer results by the LSR instruments that I just spoke about. So they brought back and they analyzed the magnetic field strength of the lunar surface, and they confirmed the results. So you have 2 powerful cross checks, and other countries have done this as well. But the rocks confirm that the moon must have had a magnetic field, and in fact, it does have a magnetic field, but that magnetic field has changed over time. And the magnetic field behavior over the last 4+ billion years, which was quite strong and then fell down to a lower level, it's actually traced in the properties and the ages of the rocks that they actually discovered. So it started off very strong and then fell down to a region that's relatively small now, of 20 microtesla, apparently today. And that transition took about 800 million years. And so they can measure not only the magnetic field, not only the time in which it took place and how the magnetic field is now, but they can measure that over the entire surface of the moon. And it agrees in different regions that the astronauts never went to, the behavior of the magnetic field on the moon is totally visible and consistent with those data collected by the astronaut samples in the rocks that were brought back to Houston for analysis by, again, independent scientists, not NASA. I love people say, oh, big NASA. NASA's really doing this for their budgets. What the hell does this have to do with getting their budget? It's understanding fundamental geophysics and the behavior of our solar system. It's incredibly fascinating. Again, I'm furious about people like this who suggest that there's some big conspiracy to do that, when there's thousands of pieces of evidence that support it and almost no evidence supporting even the claim or hint that it didn't take place, other than some, again, a hoax theory or some other theory. As he states in the interview, Stanley Kubrick, who I'm, again, personally connected to through 2001: A Space Odyssey, which you can see behind me, the neon sign I have says "Open the Pod Bay Doors." That's because I'm the associate director of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, and that was the book on which 2001 is based that Stanley Kubrick directed. So the theory is that he used this. Again, he used electrical lights. Be careful, electrical lights. They're very scary and dangerous and conspiratorial sounding. The Apollo mission is actually followed up by an Apollo mission. And that stands for the Apache Point Observatory Lunar Laser Ranging Operation. And that's contributed significantly to our understanding of the Earth-Moon system. Now, this was co-led by my former colleague, Tom Murphy, since retired from UC San Diego. Hi, Tom, if you're out there. What Tom and his collaborators did is measure the moon's position to an accuracy of, as Tom used to describe it, less than the thickness of a paperclip. Okay? Not Operation Paperclip for those conspiracy theorists out there. And this is incredibly important, not only for understanding the Earth-Moon dynamics, but to test the properties of general relativity and look for things like extra dimensions and other modifications to the inverse square law of Isaac Newton. And this is a phenomenally fascinating endeavor. And so the astronauts left these lunar retroreflectors that no matter what angle they were at, as long as you had a clear view from the Earth's surface, you could shoot a burst, high-powered laser burst from the Earth to the retroreflector, and then you knew the exact time you shot this burst of photons back. Some of them would get through the atmosphere of the Earth as they left the telescope. So you use a telescope in reverse. It makes a very powerful collimated beam that can shoot directed energy to the moon, not to destroy it or, kill off some aliens or the, maybe it was done to burn up the dummies and the stand-ins for the astronauts that Kubrick left on the moon's surface. But it's not done for that. No, it's done to measure gravity. So it's a tremendously noble pursuit. Again, these are people BART is disparaging the intent, the honesty of scientists. There was no way to get these measurements other than the lunar retroreflectors, these mirrors, especially high-tech mirrors that were left on at least 2 or 3 different Apollo missions. Okay, so I haven't even gotten to like the photographic evidence. Don't worry, we're going to get there in just a bit. And so these missions have been followed up for a variety of reasons to not only investigate the physics, the age, the chemistry of our solar system, but to measure things like gravity. It have nothing to do with national pride and so forth. It's understanding fundamental physics. Now, there have been other spacecraft that have orbited the moon, like the Chandrayaan-1 spacecraft from India, and the Lunar Atmosphere and Dust Environment Explorer, LADEE. They've mapped the moon's magnetic field from both low moon orbit, and they've done it on both the so-called light side that we can see and the dark side of the moon. Though there is no dark side, that's a misnomer. It's really maybe should be called the far side because the moon and the Earth are tidally locked together. We only see one face from the Earth's surface, but the other side of the moon gets illuminated half of the lunar month as well, just like the side that we can see. So these measurements provide invaluable assets to understand the magnetic environment and its interaction with the solar wind, because some of the properties of charges and dust can be affected by the impact of charged particles that leave the sun and get accelerated towards and affected by the moon's magnetic field. And that helps us understand space weather. By understanding space weather, we can perhaps prevent catastrophic events equivalent to electromagnetic pulses or Carrington events. We can mitigate some of the effects of those, maybe shutting off satellites in orbit or not launching astronauts in orbit to avoid burst of solar wind. So again, these are things that are so beneficial to not only the reputation of the scientists and astronauts at NASA, but to your life. And so you are being impugned by these individuals who, like SIBREL, who claim that the moon landings were a hoax. So again, this would only serve to demean and reduce the impact of NASA, which again gets less than 0.5%, 0.48% of the US budget. And that equates about $20 billion. That's going down every year lately, so it's horrible. They're going to have to shut off instruments like the Chandra X-ray Observatory if funding isn't acquired for it. And so the NASA budget's decreasing, and this person wants to see NASA fall even further. For what reason? Again, I don't get paid by NASA. I don't have any NASA contracts or grants. I've worked at NASA as an undergraduate in testing the delamination propensity of aircraft skin, which is another thing that NASA does for your public safety. So good job, BART. Let's take away the budget so that we can have more airplanes rip apart their skin and have more people get injured. Hey there, last time. It's me back. Some duties, you student. So episode work done by thousands of NASA scientists, engineers, and people that are supported by them. You actually make life on Earth and for travel and so forth less safe. So be careful when you do things like this. It's not a honorable trait, in my opinion. So understanding the impact of asteroids from understanding the crater dynamics on the moon's surface, mapping their magnetic field, again, how the magnetic field of the moon is impacted literally by these craters, helps us understand how often and what we could do to deflect asteroids and perhaps remove them from their dangerous orbits that could impact literally the Earth and, again, harm you. Lastly, I want to talk about some confirming evidence that comes not from the United States, not from big NASA, but from the Soviet Union. They launched a mission called Lunokhod, which meant Moonwalker. These are 2 different missions that were part of the Luna program. They also left retroreflectors on the moon's surface. And Tom Murphy and his colleagues in the Apollo Apache Point Lunar Laser Ranging Instrument in New Mexico, they also use those retroreflectors as additional data points for those studying the Earth-Moon system. Now, those were left by robots. The Soviets never made it to the moon. They still have it. And again, this would have to be some conspiracy that we can go to the moon, but the Soviets can't. No, they didn't want to go. They didn't care to go. After the U.S. beat them to it, they lost all the sense of national pride. So the Soviets have been there by sending robots there, but it agrees exactly with the instruments that were carried by Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong on the very first landed mission, Apollo 11. These all agree. And that's coming from an enemy of the United States back then. Now we're best friends with Russia, right? There's another mission from India, rather, called the Chandrayaan-3, which also put a lunar retroreflectors down. Those agree exactly with the previous measurements that I've talked about. Again, you're measuring the distance to the moon to the width of a fingernail or paperclip. It's incredible. And so to think that these are all done in some huge conspiracy lasting over 50 years, half a century, involving scientists that study general relativity, magnetic fields, cosmic rays, solar wind, it becomes preposterous. And lastly, we're planning now to go to the moon via the Artemis missions, and hopefully past guest and friend of the channel, Jessica Meir, she will be the first woman to land on the moon's surface by 2030. You know, it keeps getting delayed. These will be billion-dollar-plus missions every time they go up. So that shows you, again, it's so expensive. That's 5% of NASA's budget for every mission. And they want to make sure they're safe. So they're using the technology, the landing developed by NASA in the 1960s to get there, and further proven out through the actual or missions to the moon that included everything from Apollo 11 to Apollo 17 with the absence of Apollo 13. Again, that would have to be staged, that they had some accident, that they blew off the...
Lo dijo irónicamente que ahora eran amigos de los rusos, ¿no? Yo sé que a lo mejor capaz que todos estos científicos son medio autistas y no, pero son más autistas ustedes si no entendieron la ironía.
The oxygen circulator as depicted in the great movie, and that they didn't go there, even though
más sarcasmo que ironía, no soy un corky.
They did launch, and most of the cost is in the launch and recovery, not in the actual expedition on the moon's surface. That's just, you know, once they get there, they already have those resources launched into space. So that had to be fake too, by the way, Bart, in order to have consistency that this whole thing. And again, for what purpose? To get some huge budget when their budget's gone down? Does that make any sense to anyone out there? I'm serious. Leave a comment down below if you're more persuaded by Bart. And then lastly, I haven't really even gotten to the photographic evidence. So as Groucho Marx said when he was caught sleeping, you know, around in some movie, and his wife comes in the movie and he says, "Who are you going to trust? Me or your lying eyes?" So we're going to show you some pictures that were taken, not by the, I don't want to, be too much of a cheerleader for NASA. I'm going to show you pictures taken by the Indian spacecraft that orbit around. And there's equivalent pictures that have been taken by Chinese scientists.
Paco dice, ¿cuál es la verdadera historia detrás de la carrera espacial? Armas nucleares en el espacio.
And their spacecraft that have orbited around, and of course by the Soviet Union. And actually you have seen it from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO. That's also been used to take images of the landing sites themselves. And everything agrees, the positions of the craters, where the spacecraft is, the debris left behind once the ascent module took off from the surface. All these would have to be done in conspiracy. For what purpose? And the best evidence that this Mr. SIBREL has is electrical lights. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that the evidence is overwhelming. And when I hear people like past guest Patrick Bet-David, and I hear people like Tucker Carlson, who never be a guest, but when I hear them speak about it, like they're open to anything, like the government lied to me once, so I'm never going to trust the government ever again. That's infantile. You should trust that which you have evidence for. And you should believe things that you want to have faith in. So you can believe in supernatural beings or gods or, saviors, lords, whatever you like. That is based on belief. But when you have facts that can be checked and disproven by other facts, then that is science. And you should trust that which you have evidence for. You may have belief for stuff. You may have a desire to want to portray a narrative for financial purposes, for whatever purposes you like. But you can't say that you're entitled to your own facts. No, there's one set of facts in nature. We try to do it. And nothing makes scientists more excited than disproving other scientists. Okay, we're very competitive. It's a zero-sum game in science where you only can get so much funding for certain things. And you want to test and hopefully maybe find a flaw in our understanding as before. So I'm going to have copious amounts of data down below, links to follow-up material, images you can find yourself. And none of this involved, eyewitness testimony and so forth, but it's a lot more convincing to a real scientist like me and many of you out there than the claims of some shadows that could have been produced by electrical lighting. Look, by the way, Bart, if you want to show that, set up the diagram of how that would look, how you would actually reproduce it, and the colors of the moon's surface. By the way, I gave Joe a piece of the moon's surface that looks a lot like this, and they were talking in the show about color-corrected video, and that is Bart's expertise, right? He's a filmmaker, not a scientist. He even says that himself. And he says, oh, it's caramel and it's gray. There's many different interactions between the moon's surface, its reflectance, and the amount of light that gets produced. And we see light in different colors back on the Earth due to Earthshine, where light bounces from the sun off of the Earth to the moon, back to the Earth. And we can measure the albedo, which is the reflectance. And the albedo, Bart, I have to tell you, is chromatic. It has different dependence on color, so different wavelengths of it can depict at different times. And perhaps they color corrected at one time, they didn't color correct at another time, but you still haven't provided any evidence for why that shouldn't be the case, that it shouldn't have different colors. This thing has specks of caramel color, of gray, of white, of crystal. This is a fragment of the moon's surface that was blasted off the moon's surface by a meteorite, which crashed on the moon's surface instead of hitting the Earth, pulverized the crust surface of the moon, and then after millions of years perhaps orbiting around the Earth, eventually landed in Africa, collected, and then I bought it on the internet. And it has the same surface chemistry properties as measured by spectroscopic measurements. You don't even have to trust the Apollo mission. You can trust the crust measurements of the composition based on spectroscopy from literally thousands of astronomers, astrophysicists around the world. But you should also trust the Apollo return samples, because that's firsthand evidence, if you will. And there's almost nothing better than that, rather than pure speculation that the moon landing was faked. For what purpose? By Stanley Kubrick, who never attested to the fact that he did that. So he had to have a cover up. His family had a cover up. So Bart, the offer stands. If you'd like to go back on Joe Rogan, he'll have us both back on. I'll bring in samples. You can examine them, and we can debate it. You can even have your own, as I said, you can have your own theory. Can't have your own facts, my friend. So I hope you enjoy.
Bueno, guachines, este fue la refutación de este astrofísico, el doctor Keating. Me parece que fue bastante claro. Yo creo que si querés creer que el hombre no fue a la luna, bueno, estás en tu derecho, pero me parece que hay suficiente evidencia de enemigos de Estados Unidos hasta el día de hoy que han podido corroborar, ¿no?, las cosas que se dejaron en la luna, en otros viajes que han hecho tanto China, la India, Rusia y demás. Han dejado espejos, han dejado cosas que podés medir la distancia con láseres especiales. Me parece que creo que la evidencia es abrumadora y contundente, digamos, de que el hombre fue a la luna. Creo que nos cuesta creerlo, o a mucha gente le cuesta creerlo, porque, bueno, fue una hazaña increíble con la tecnología de esa época, incentivada por la política, por la guerra y por la Guerra Fría. Y bueno, en todos estos años, desde ese hecho hasta hoy, hemos visto a la política y a los estados mentir tanto y engañar tanto a la opinión pública, y sobre todo después también de la pandemia, en donde, bueno, es lógico que haya gente que dude de todo y que dude hasta de esto, ¿no? Porque después de todo le falta a la política y a ciertas instituciones estar a la altura de lo que se hizo en esa época, de alguna manera. Y se han ido degradando y degradando y degradando. Y bueno, y me parece que es importante también entender que la ciencia es algo que se va construyendo, ¿no?, de a ladrillos, uno encima del otro, por el saber y los experimentos y el conocimiento que va desarrollando un científico, después otro encima de lo que construyó ese, y otro encima del entendimiento que construyó el otro, y que nada, y se chequea entre miles y miles de científicos de todo el mundo, de distintas naciones, y como el chabón dice, es un ambiente súper competitivo en donde todos compiten por financiamiento y todos tienen que mostrar algo, y tienen que probarlo, y después tiene que ser chequeado por sus pares. No es tan fácil falsear este tipo de cosas, ¿no? Pero bueno, como dije al principio, vos podés creer lo que quieras, como dice el chabón también, pero me parece que la evidencia y la realidad es una sola. Así que bueno, guachines, con esto terminamos el programa y la noche del Pela de hoy. Terminamos temprano, pero arrancamos temprano. Y bueno, este fue el especial de la llegada del hombre a la luna. Bueno, guachines, nos vemos. Abrazo para todos. Tal vez seguramente mañana haga la mañana del Pela. Nos vemos.